In times of universal deceit, truth is the only rebellion left. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Everett Piper, and this is The Rebellion. Thanks for listening to today's show. Today's topic is immigration once again. I've covered a couple times, and there's been a little bit of interest out there in listening to these particular podcasts on immigration. I'm going to guess that a lot of people have interest in it and are trying to make sense of the conversation we're having in the United States right now and perhaps elsewhere in Canada, Mexico, and European countries. It seems that immigration is a hot topic, so I'm going to talk about it again today. More specifically, I'm going to talk about Pope Francis's recent letter that he sent to the United States bishops on this issue, where he told the bishops that Jesus was an exile, a refugee, and he suggested, or at least inferred, that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were somewhat akin to the illegal immigrants that are crossing the border into the United States right now, because the point of Pope Francis's letter was to call the United States bishops to lead their congregants, lead the body of Christ, lead the church in being more attentive to the dignity that each person deserves as a person being made in the image of God. So that's what the Pope is challenging the bishops to think about. And he's inferring that the laws of the United States of America, as they're being enforced by the Trump administration, are laws that are not in full compliance with that dignity of every human being. How do we respond to this? That's today's show. I'm going to give you 3 or 4 points of response after I read excerpts from the Pope's letter so that you can hear exactly what he said, and then I'll give you my response to that. And I'll try to give it in the context of being faithful and true to the Bible, what the Bible says about Jesus. Was he really in exile as an infant in Egypt? Was he a refugee? Did he flee his native land and go to a foreign land and live there illegally in violation of the foreign land's laws? Is that true? Is it accurate and fair to paint this picture, as so many liberal evangelicals do, and the Pope does, and others continue to do, that Jesus was a refugee and Donald Trump would be showing a hard heart and a lack of respect to the Holy Family today because he wouldn't allow them to enter the United States in the same manner that they had to enter Egypt as they were fleeing their country, to use the Pope's language, back in the first century. All right. Before we get into that, however, remember that our sponsor is an organization that helps people that are in need and does respect the dignity of every human being and is aggressive in doing so by helping the tens of thousands of Christians in Nigeria that are presently under persecution. That organization is a ministry called equippingthepersecuted.org. That's equippingthepersecuted.org. As I've told you before on this show, this is an organization that reaches out to widows and orphans and provides supplies, food, clothing, schools, orphanages, hospitals. It does all of these things, which other organizations do too, but what it makes Equipping the Persecuted unique is that they commit to providing at least 80% of every dollar that you give to the actual service of these people in need, rather than reversing the equation and using 70, 80% of your dollar to pay their own salaries and administrative overhead. And then there's just a small percentage of your dollar left to actually go to support the people that you gave to in the first place. No, Equipping the Persecuted has an 80-20 rule where at least 80% of your dollar is serving the needs of the persecuted Christians in Nigeria. That's very critical, and it's a big difference between them and other organizations. And another thing that makes Equipping the Persecuted worth your consideration, and you should go make a tax-deductible gift right now, is the fact that they're not just reactive after the persecution takes place. They're proactive. They go into these towns and villages and teach our brothers and sisters in Christ how to defend themselves and how to secure their communities. That is critical. They try to stop the persecution before it happens in the first place. So if you want to make a difference, go to equippingthepersecuted.org and make a gift today. equippingthepersecuted.org. So back to today's show. I said I want to talk about Pope Francis and his recent letter to the bishops, the Catholic bishops in the United States. This letter was sent on February 10th, 2025, so not that long ago, less than a month ago. And in that letter, which was titled, I'll give you the official title if you want to go Google it and read the entire letter. It's not that long, it's only about one page. But I'm not going to read the whole thing today for the sake of time. I'm just going to take excerpts within context and treat them fairly and tell you what the Pope said. And I'm going to respond to those things that I either agree or disagree with in that letter and hopefully help you understand why. The letter is titled Letter of the Holy Father Francis to the Bishops of the United States of America. And here is an excerpt or two of what the Pope actually says in that letter. Dear brothers in the episcopate, the book of Exodus invites us to look at the reality of our time so clearly marked by the phenomenon of migration as a decisive moment in history to reaffirm the infinite and transcendent dignity of every human person. I'll read it again. The book of Exodus invites us to look at the reality of our time, so clearly marked by the phenomenon of migration, he says, as a decisive moment in our history, to reaffirm the infinite and transcendent dignity of every human person. Now, I want to go on record right now. I agree with what he's saying, that the infinite and transcendent dignity of every human person is paramount. It is a priority. None of us should set it aside. Every human being, male and female, adult or child, boy or girl, regardless of residency, regardless of the country that they were born in, has dignity. It's transcendent and it's infinite. Every human being is made in the image of God. Every Bible-believing Christian should affirm that. Every decent human being should affirm that. Okay, I agree with that. More from the Pope. Even a cursory examination of the Church's social doctrine emphatically shows that Jesus Christ did not live apart from the difficult experience of being expelled from his own land, having to take refuge in a society and a culture foreign to his own. Now, I emphasized expelled and refuge because I want you to think about the Pope's use of those two words. Was Jesus expelled from Israel as an infant? Were Mary, Joseph, and Jesus expelled from Israel? Is that biblical? Is that historically accurate? And second, were they actual refugees in Egypt? What do you think? What's your first reaction when you hear that? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What's the Bible say? Okay. The family of Nazareth, referring to Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, were in exile, said the Pope. They were immigrants in Egypt, and they were refugees. And they are the model, the example, and the consolation of immigrants and pilgrims of every age and country, of all refugees who are forced to leave their homeland for foreign lands. Francis then goes on and he emphasizes this, the dignity of every human being without exception. And then he stated that all the Christian faithful are called upon to consider the legitimacy of norms and public policies in light of the dignity of every person. So he's shifting to policies in the United States, the Trump administration, and the enforcement of our immigration laws, closing of our borders, a different policy than what the Biden administration employed. He's telling us that we have the obligation to review and consider the legitimacies of norms and public policies in light of the dignity of every person. I agree with that. Is public policy, are our laws treating every human being with dignity and respect? Do we have the same expectations of everybody, regardless of race, color, sex, and age? Do we? Are our immigration policies fair when it comes to those things? Finally, he said this is not a minor issue, he says. He then goes on to say the authentic rule of law is verified precisely in the dignified treatment that all people deserve. I'll say that again. This is not a minor issue. The authentic rule of law is verified precisely in the dignified treatment that all people deserve. And finally, the Pope concluded by saying this, I exhort all the faithful of the Catholic Church and all men and women of good will not to give in to the narratives that discriminate against and cause unnecessary suffering for any specific categories or groups of people. Close quote. Now, that's a fair summary, taking key excerpts out of the Pope's letter to the Catholic bishops here in the United States, dated February 10th, 2025. So how should Christians and all other, to use the Pope's language, men and women of goodwill respond to Pope Francis's challenge? Well, here's my response. First, I think we should all agree with the Pope that the dignity of every human being is paramount. I've already said that, but I want to emphasize it again. I agree with him. The dignity of every human being is paramount. And as an example of that, to use his language again, I believe that the personhood and worth, quote unquote, Pope's language, of the hundreds of thousands of children who have been trafficked into the heartland of the United States of America each year because of Joe Biden and the Democrats' open border policies. Okay? Policies that apparently the Pope supports because he's leaning into those policies and criticizing the new administration for doing it differently. I believe in the dignity of every human being and the personhood and the worth of all of these children who have been trafficked into the United States because of these policies of the previous administration, policies that apparently the Pope supports. I believe in the dignity and that they deserve dignified treatment and that these little boys and girls deserve help, deserve laws that protect them, that will be enforced so that drug cartels and sex traffickers can't continue to profit off of prostituting these children by the tens and hundreds of thousands. See, the point I'm making here is that it's real easy to say, well, we care for the family that's crossing the border, but what about the tens of thousands of children that are being trafficked across the same border under the same policies? Don't you care about them? And why aren't you celebrating the fact that our laws are now being enforced so that these kids won't be trafficked any further, any longer across our borders? Literally, thousands upon thousands of children have already been stopped at the border from being trafficked into the United States since Trump became president for the second term. Tens of thousands of children have not come across our border. There's less incentive for the drug cartels and these sex traffickers to try to make money off of these kids by bringing them into the United States and then having them disappear into the heartland and into our major cities. I care about them. I care about those children. I care about their dignity. I care about their treatment. And I think the Pope should too. Here's another point. Point number 2. I think we should agree with him that all, quote unquote, narratives that discriminate against any categories of people are wrong, and that categories, use his language, such as the legal residents and citizens of Aurora, Colorado, and Springfield, Ohio, should not be subjected to the unnecessary suffering, to use his language, that is being forced on them by elitists from the Vatican or elsewhere who seem to care more about virtue signaling than the violence these American citizens are presently suffering as the result of ignoring, quote unquote, the authentic rule of law. Third, we should agree with the Pope that human beings deserve dignified treatment and that American women such as Lake and Riley deserve better than the indignity of being left to the mercy of Venezuelan thugs and rapists and murderers when these women simply want to go for a jog in the park or across their local campus. And finally, I think we should all agree with the Pope that none of this is a minor issue, and that those who live behind iron gates and stone walls, such as the Vatican, might want to engage in a little self-reflection before presuming to scold good, hard-working, blue-collar Americans for just wanting clean neighborhoods and secure homes and safe public parks and streets. In other words, and here's my point. In other words, as it is a bit presumptuous for those who live in glass houses to cast stones, so it is also presumptuous for those who live behind. I'll say that one more time. For those who live behind a stone fortress to tell everyone else to tear down their walls. And here's one last thing. I think we need to challenge the Pope and all those who agree with him to go read their Bible, and more specifically, the book of Exodus, just a bit more carefully. This claim that Jesus and Mary and Joseph were akin to today's illegal immigrants is simply not true. First, the Holy Family did not flee Israel because they were forced to do so. They were not forced to leave Israel, as the Pope claims. They chose to leave because God sent Joseph a dream telling him to do so. That's different. And second, there is zero evidence anywhere in history or in the Bible that the Holy Family broke any immigration laws during their journeys. They didn't. We don't know anything about them being illegal. We can only assume that they were being very attentive to comply with all laws because they didn't want to be challenged, and they didn't want to be forced to go back under the threat of Herod. And then finally, Egypt was a province of the Roman Empire at the time, as was Israel. It was all part of the Roman Empire. So moving from Nazareth to Cairo was somewhat akin from moving to Ohio to Oklahoma or California to Florida. You might leave one of those states because you don't like what they're doing about abortion or education, and you leave there to find a better place to live. That doesn't make you a refugee. You're not in exile, and you weren't forced to leave. You chose to leave because you want a better place, a safer place, a place that is going to honor the law, perhaps, and not let dangerous people into your neighborhoods and communities. So this claim that Jesus was an illegal immigrant and a refugee, and that he was in exile, et cetera, that he was akin to today's illegals that are crossing our southern border or moving from one European country to another without complying with the laws of the host country. This claim that that is who Jesus and Mary and Joseph were is just plain wrong. And it's also wrong to tell Americans to ignore their safety and their security unless you're willing to do so yourself. So I'm sorry. When the Pope lives behind huge stone walls, and I've been to the Vatican, huge stone walls with iron gates, and the Swiss Guard on 24-hour patrol, when the Pope has armed guards and travels behind bulletproof glass, when you have an apartment in this papal complex where you have total privacy and seclusion and total security because of, like I said, the iron gates, the stone walls, and the armed guards, it's a little presumptuous for you to criticize others for wanting to have a wall of security around their neighborhood, around their home, or around their country. And if you're going to start throwing stones and say we're not treating people with dignity, then I want you to look at the people of Aurora, Colorado, and Springfield, Ohio, the children who are being trafficked and the women who are afraid to even go run, jog in their local park. I want you to look them in the eye and do so under the auspices of the dignity that they deserve, as well as others that you seem to be so concerned with that don't want to comply with the immigration laws of the United States of America. I'm Dr. Everett Piper, and this is The Rebellion.